Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Walsh. I'm the president of the Federalist Society at Northern Illinois University. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming. And if there's more food out there after you've eaten one time, go ahead and help yourself to some more. Briefly, I'd just like to go over a few things procedurally and introduce you to our board and our speakers and tell you a little bit about the Federalist Society. You'll see on the aisle over here, there are some handouts about the Federalist Society in particular, as well as the sign-in sheets. We need everybody to sign in, please. Alexis is modeling them for you there. And then also there are sheets, they were by the booth when you came in. But basically, if you don't know what any of this is about, as far as the debate, this is a nice sort of cheat sheet that our policy analyst Dan made up for all of you to look at. All right, so the Federalist Society, what we do as an organization here at the law school is we bring in two speakers and let them debate an issue and let you decide. So while the Federalist Society in and of itself is a conservative libertarian organization, we're not telling you that's how you have to feel. We like to do both sides and let you decide. I would like to first thank and introduce our board. We have a great board, and you've all done a really, really wonderful job helping me put this and all the other events together. So I will begin, when I say your name, just stand up and wave or just wave, either way. So I'll begin with our Vice President, Sam Perkins, Secretary, Alexis Aranda, Treasurer, Ryan Reese, who's probably out there working on the food, Reception Coordinator, Todd McPenkow, Sergeant-at-Arms, Nick Perrone, Policy Analyst, Dan Knudsen. Our Law School Outreach Chair is Austin Davies, and our University Outreach Chair, Daniel Marks. Technical Advisor, Lucas Park, and we have 3 L advisors, including our former President, Samantha Brown, along with Jeremy McCabe and Isioma Arquita. Quickly, I'll tell you what the format will be. First will be Professor Forte. He will go for 12 minutes with his initial argument, followed by Professor Pickerel with up to 12 minutes, and then each party will have 5 minutes to rebut the opponent. And we will conclude promptly at 12:50, so if you have class, please don't leave before then. I promise 12:50, we're going to take a break so you can get up and go and not disturb anyone. And we will have question and answers if time allows at that time. So I would like to next introduce our speakers. I'll begin with Professor David Forte. He's a professor of law at the Professor of Law at Cleveland State University, has a BA from Harvard College, MA from University of Manchester, PhD from the University of Toronto, and a JD from Columbia University. Professor Forte served as Chief Counsel to the United States Delegation to the United Nations and alternate delegate to the Security Council during the Reagan administration. He's authored a number of briefs before the United States Supreme Court, has frequently testified before Congress, and consulted with the Department of State on human rights and international affairs issues. He's appeared and spoken frequently on radio and television, nationally and internationally, and he writes and speaks nationally on topics such as constitutional law, religious liberty, Islamic law, the rights of families, and international affairs. And his teaching competencies include constitutional law, the First Amendment, Islamic law, jurisprudence, natural law, international human rights, and constitutional history. And I had to cut his bio down by, that's like this much. And so he's very accomplished, certainly, but that's just some of the highlights. And I'd next like to introduce Professor Mitch Pickerel, who came all the way over from the other side of campus at Northern Illinois University, teaches in the Political Science Department. He's an associate professor. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, JD from Indiana University, Bloomington, and BA from Purdue University. Prior to coming to NIU, he was assistant and associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Washington State University. And his teaching and research interests include American politics, law and courts, constitutional law and theory, and federalism. His current research focuses on the relationship between the Supreme Court and other branches of government. And he's the author of Congress and Constitutional Deliberation, The Impact of Judicial Review in a Separated System, and various book chapters, articles in journals such as Perspective on Politics, Georgetown Law Journal, Santa Clara Law Review, and Law and Policy. And again, This is just highlights from his extensive resume. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first argument from Professor David Forte. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Can you hear me if I speak this far from the mic? Good. I have two sons. They're both in their mid-20s, and this weekend, after I go back, my wife and I are having a charity garage sale. We're selling lots of childhood things. All the proceeds are going to go to charity, and I have a great reluctance to part with the Playmobiles and the Legos. I love those toys so much because they have so much more fun than when I was a kid growing up. We had stupid games like, do you want to play house? You know, you be the daddy. And I go blow up Tommy's house, you know. But two of the games that we used to play, I recall, were Red Light and May I. Did you kids ever play that when you were growing up? Terrible games, right now. What did they? Red Light was the back of the leader would be towards you, and you try to sneak up closest until that person would say red light, and if you were moved, you got caught, and you had to go all the way back. May I was completely opposite. The leader would turn and say, David, you can take 2 baby steps. May I? Yes, you may. And if you didn't say may I, you couldn't take the 2 baby steps. So these were socialization games. The may I was to teach you how to be polite, and the red light was to teach you how not to get caught. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is a sophisticated version of may I, and a sophisticated version of red light. Section 2 is red light, which says to states, if you continue or if you embark on a legislative program that denies people the right to vote because of their race, stop. We're going to get you. We're going to sue you, and we're going to make you stop and maybe pay damages. That's Section 2. Section 5 rather, is, Section 4 is the may I section. That section says to a number of states who previously, up till 1965, had engaged in significant discrimination against black people because of the right to vote, mainly Southerns. They were all Southern states to begin with. They have to say may I to the Attorney General for any change in their electoral system. The Attorney General has to pre-clear any change they want. Now, those of you who are young enough to play may I realize that there's an inherent arbitrariness in it. The person who's saying, David or Mary, you may take 2 giant steps or 2 baby steps, has complete control over who gets to the finish line. And that's what Justice Roberts saw in this case, Shelby County versus Holder. He had noted that in 1965, there was such an extreme history of discrimination against black voters in these particular jurisdictions that the 1965 Act, which was to run for 5 years, was appropriately naming those jurisdictions as requiring pre-clearance for their, and banning certain tests like literacy tests, which were used to keep blacks off the rolls, and requiring them to pre-clear. And the court in 1965, in the Katzenbach case, says this is strong medicine. It's strong medicine because of the damage that the South had done to people of color who needed to vote. Well, that act was passed in 1970 for 5 years. It was repassed in 1975 for 7 years. It was repassed in 1982 for 25 years. And it was repassed in 2006 for another 25 years. But it's got a crowd of solicitors. Well, 15, that maybe we're doing okay. But between 1965 and 2004, Justice Roberts noted, all those jurisdictions which had previously discriminated against blacks had turned around 180 degrees. 5 out of the 6 states, which were on the May I list, now had black voting at a higher proportion than white voting. And the other was just a percentage point below white voting. Most of them elected black candidates. And so Justice Roberts looked at this and said, what are we doing? We are picking among a number of jurisdictions in a discriminatory, prejudicial way without any grounds anymore. There are no grounds to say why these states have to pre-clear. It's almost irrational. And on top of that, it violates a fundamental principle of the federal system, namely that all states have equal sovereignty and have to be treated with equal dignity by the sovereign federal government. Only when the states, under the 15th Amendment, were shown specifically to have egregiously violated the law in permitting people to vote or in denying people to vote because of their race, would this kind of extraordinary focused attack on legislation, an exception to the equal treatment of states, be valid. But that's no longer valid. And therefore, that part of the law is unconstitutional. The red light part of the law is still constitutional. Any state which puts forward a voting scheme that works to disenfranchise people of minorities, now linguistic minorities as well, they can be sued and they can be brought to court, and they will have to defend, and they can be made to stop. What they can't do now is what is not permitted is that they cannot be forced to go before the Attorney General beseeching, as Justice Roberts says, the Attorney General permission to pass laws which are traditionally right within the state's sovereignty, namely election laws. You can't get more political in terms of election laws. So he brought up this notion of equal sovereignty. And how valid a notion is it? Well, it turns out when you go and you look at the history of the United States, and the history of the founding of the United States, it's bedrock. From the Northwest Ordinance, of which this state and my state were formed, of 1787, the country made, under the Articles of Confederation and then confirmed after the Constitution, the fundamental decision that the country would not expand by New York expanding west and Virginia expanding west, but by new states who would be of equal dignity, validity, and sovereignty with the eastern states. It's extraordinary. Those states who were in control of the country and of its future made themselves predictably to be a minority of the future. On what basis? On the basis of equal dignity of other sovereign states. It's an extraordinary act of self-abnegation of power that we did. And so when the federal government comes in and skews that fundamental moral principle of equal sovereignty, then Justice Roberts says it has to have a much higher justification than rational basis, a minimum scrutiny. This is a bedrock principle. It can be broken only in sort of a strict, he didn't say what test he was using, but only in sort of a middle tier or higher level scrutiny. And that was the fundamental basis of his opinion. It did not undo the Voting Rights Act. What it did do was undo a prejudicial act of the federal government against the states. Now, what about state sovereignty? Let's make sure that we don't go overboard. In the early 19th century, a number of states did go overboard. South Carolina tried to move what was called the nullification process, where they claimed a state could nullify a federal law if it was contrary to the Constitution. That flips our system. That makes the states on top of the federal government. That wasn't it. Right? But after the New Deal, whatever area of residual sovereignty that the states enjoyed through their police power, which, as you probably know from common law, means the power to legislate on the health, welfare, morals, and safety of the people, the core power of what states have in relation to their people. After the New Deal, the federal government, through commerce power legislation and other legislation, continually intruded into state sovereignty. Under the Rehnquist Court, there was a partial re-aggregation of state sovereignty in a number of cases, where the Rehnquist Court tried to form a kind of immunity of the core functions of a state to be able to determine how much to pay its police, or in later cases, the state being immune from the federal government telling a state legislature what laws it had to pass, or telling a state executive what federal laws they had to enforce. The state legislature was sovereignly independent. It could make its own decisions. The federal government wanted to regulate something, go through Congress, go through the spending clause, but you cannot dictate to the core sovereignty of the state. Now, what does Justice Roberts do? The Rehnquist attempt to create this core area of sovereign independence of the states, not anything like the 19th century nullification, just what is kind of the residual dignity of this mixed sovereignty of our country. Justice Roberts is revivifying it. And he's revivifying it in a number of ways. The most recent is this case of Shelby County, saying that the federal government, now think about this, you've got an executive official, and before a state can pass a piece of legislation, it's got to go to an executive official for approval of a different sovereign. You can't get more intrusive into a traditional sovereign function of a state. Lastly, we know we Americans are a really contrary people. We were the first people to say that we could rule ourselves and to try to keep our vices in check so that we don't tyrannize over ourselves. First people in modern times. First people to set up standards of what equal dignity was, knowing that we had not yet met them. Imagine that. Set them up in the Declaration of Independence, knowing that we had not met them, to convict ourselves of what we should be. The other thing that we were is we invented the idea of mixed sovereignty. As Justice Kennedy said, we split the atom of sovereignty. That was totally illogical to the Europeans. Sovereignty means, the word means, the power above which there is no other. It's unitary. Not for Americans. Not for Americans. As Justice Kennedy said, Americans came up with the idea that having more than one government makes you freer. And he was right. And so now what I say is kudos to Justice Roberts for bringing back the doctrine of mixed sovereignty and the equal dignity of the states, which will help guarantee more freedom because there is an area which the federal government cannot enter into. Thanks a lot.
Get some pictures up here. All right. I have a few slides to, in part, keep me in check so I don't go on tangents. Students who've had me in class know that that's not uncommon. But also, as the political science side of me likes pictures and data. And so, you know, when I think it's sort of, to me, it's a very strange thing to be in a debate where I have an opponent. Because I sort of see us at the university as engaging in kind of Socratic dialogue, right? And trying to find truth. And of course we have disagreements, but what we want to do is have a discussion about why we have those disagreements. But at the same time, we're not very good in our society today about kind of pointing out that we also have agreements. And I agree with Professor Forte on a number of things. Okay, so I'll just start with that. I'll be very brief because I don't want to run out of time and get to the core. But I agree, clearly there was a commitment to state sovereignty at the founding, right? And we can't deny, if you're, no matter what a diehard states' rights you are, and Professor Forte acknowledges this as well, right? We can't deny that there have been shifts in power to the federal government, and we have to, I think we can't deny their legitimacy at some level, at least those that have been created through constitutional amendment. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment clearly limited state powers and shifted power to the federal government. With the New Deal, although the administrative state wasn't sanctioned through the legitimate process, the amendment process, and we may wish to go back to a 1933, pre-1933 era, some people may, that isn't going to happen. That's fantasy land, and I don't like living in fantasy land. I mean, maybe 10 minutes a week when I buy my lottery ticket, fine. But But nonetheless, these shifts also do presuppose that there's state sovereignty, right? We're only limiting state power because state sovereignty exists, this mixed sovereignty that Professor Forte acknowledged exists, right? And I think a lot of people that want to get rid of federalism today sort of say, well, look, states' rights was all about slavery and Jim Crow. And it's true, the states' rights mantra was used to justify and maintain those appointed institutions. But there are plenty of theoretical reasons to maintain a federal system in which states have power. Laboratories, states are laboratories of democracy. States reflect local and regional political culture. And we see that today with things like marijuana laws, same-sex marriage, immigration law. States are experimenting, and obviously the makeup of states varies in terms of preferences. I think as part of the broader political process, the court has a legitimate role to play in protecting state sovereignty. Now, I'm probably very different from some law professors. I don't necessarily think the court is part of the political process. I don't see laws being independent from that process. So pick a role. This is a debate. There's got to be some disagreement. And I think there probably is here, right? And that is, I'm less optimistic about the Roberts Court commitment to federalism and state sovereignty. I think the Rehnquist Court did all the heavy lifting, and I've got some precedents up here, primarily in the areas of the 10th, 11th, 14th Amendment Enforcement Clause, and the Commerce Power, trying to limit the scope of Congress, including the police powers of states. And I think the Roberts Court has, in many of these areas, followed the Rehnquist Court. But I think there's evidence that its commitment is weaker and that it'll throw states under the bus when it wants to achieve other objectives. So let's compare them. I want to make 4 points about the differences between the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court with respect to state sovereignty and federalism. Right. First of all, Rehnquist and O'Connor were philosophically committed to federalism and state sovereignty. I don't think Roberts and Alito are. And I'll discuss why that is, but in part it goes to the presidents who appointed them. Nixon and Reagan were committed to new federalism. George W. Bush was not. Second, the Roberts Court judicial review decisions tend to be more narrow than that of the Rehnquist. And I want to throw some data up because I'm involved in a research project with my colleague in the political science department, Art Ward, in which we're collecting data on how the Supreme Court strikes down or upholds legislation. And we're trying to fine-tune how we measure the exercise of judicial review to capture narrowness and breadth of decisions. And the Roberts Court tends to be more narrow, and the effect of that, I think, has been to give the federal government more authority than the Rehnquist Court was willing to do. Third, the Roberts Court decisions often involve a second issue dimension, which is more important to the majority. And I've kind of foreshadowed that. I think that's the case in Shelby County, and it's certainly the case in issues involving big business. Finally, the Roberts Court sides with the feds more in preemption cases than the Rehnquist Court does. And that sort of flows from the third, and some of these points are interrelated. So let's start out with looking at where the justices came from, right? What the presidents who appointed them wanted to get out of their appointment to the Supreme Court. So Rehnquist was first appointed in 1971 by Richard Nixon. Nixon, of course, developed new federalism. Nixon's whole political strategy to win the presidency and to pave the road for a Republican majority was the Southern strategy. And a key component of that was states' rights. Now again, that may have connoted some disturbing things for some of us regarding what the South meant by states' rights. But Nixon was committed to federalism in other areas as well. He was committed to a type of cooperative federalism, giving states more flexibility to implement federal policy through things like block grants. Ronald Reagan appoints Senator O'Connor. Yes, well, I should say too, Rehnquist comes from Arizona. He practiced law in Phoenix, and he was legal advisor to Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign. Senator O'Connor is when Reagan makes good on his campaign promise to appoint the first woman, but he reaches down to a state court judge, once again from Arizona, one of the key states, I think, in the resurgence of a states' rights kind of political agenda. And importantly, O'Connor had been a state legislator, and she'd been a state judge. And there's plenty of evidence in her opinions about her commitment to federalism, and really it comes out of her experience. She just hated the idea of the feds coming in and telling state legislators what they could and could not do. Then Reagan elevates Rehnquist. Bush was not committed. I don't think there's any evidence that in their background, but Roberts and Alito have the kind of philosophical commitment to federalism. Bush himself, although when he was governor, said, you know, I don't believe in medical marijuana policy, but I think it's a state issue. When he becomes president, what happens? The Department of Justice starts going after medical marijuana states, especially California, and decides that it is a federal issue. So next, let's look at what type of. Let's look at how the courts exercise judicial review, because I want to argue that Roberts' court is more narrow when it comes to federal legislation. If you look at just whether or not they strike laws down, federal laws down, or uphold it, they look very similar, right? The Roberts court strikes down about 53% of federal laws in the first 6 years of its existence, compared to 58%. But if you use this data that I'm collecting, and I can talk about this more in Q&A, what you see is the Roberts court strikes things down as applied, far more often than the Rehnquist court, which means it's not an attack on Congress for the scope of federal power. It's telling the executive branch they've got to apply federal law in a different way. That's very different than the Rehnquist court, which was very confident and struck a lot of federal legislation down on its face and really went after the scope of the national legislative power. Okay, so that's the second point, that I think the Roberts court's more narrow. Third, I think oftentimes we have multiple issue dimensions in cases. And this is where I think the Roberts court's happy to use federalism doctrine to support its decision, but it's the real stimulus to the court, the majority at this point, might be the other issue. So Shelby County, I agree with Professor Forte. I think it was a pretty narrow decision, and some commentators around the country don't agree. Rick Hasten's blog, for example. But I think it was as much about race and notions of a colorblind constitution, notions that race relations have changed over time, which I think Roberts has, as it was state sovereignty. And state sovereignty was kind of icing on the cake. It helped the argument along, but I don't think it was essential in his case. If you look at other cases pitting state power against federal power in traditional tort area and other areas, Regal, I just throw a couple up there, but there's a series of them. I'll show some aggregate data here to close. The Roberts court has sided with the federal government. Okay, it basically said the federal law preempted Maine law trying to keep cigarettes, traditional police power, health and safety, which Professor Forte mentioned, health and safety of your people. Maine's trying to keep cigarettes from getting to its kids, but the court says no, federal government preemption, you can't pass that law. And there's a series of those, which pushes me to the issue of preemption, the fourth point, and we'll take a look at some data. If you look at all the votes of Rehnquist, O'Connor, Roberts, and Alito in preemption cases, right? Rehnquist voted for the federal government. This is where the issue is whether the federal government preempts state law. Rehnquist and O'Connor both voted for the states a majority of the time, whereas Roberts and Alito overwhelmingly vote for the federal government, 77%, 75%. I think this is a major shift from the Rehnquist court to the Roberts court. And again, I think it gives us reason to question. We can look at one case and try to make a lot out of it, but I do think it gives us question, at least in terms of systematic evidence, reason to question the overall commitment to state sovereignty and to state power vis-a-vis the federal government. And finally, if you look at outcomes, the Warren Court was, not surprisingly, the highest supporter of the federal government in preemption cases. That declined from the Berger Court to the Rehnquist Court. We don't have a lot of cases. We do have to be careful here drawing conclusions. But the trend with the Roberts Court tends to be to side with the feds. And again, it's particularly when you have another issue area involved. And it's primarily when the Department of Commerce gets involved and you have the business interests and a lot of amicus briefs filed. So there's my pitch that yes, state sovereignty is important. Yeah, the Roberts Court's not doing a whole lot of harm necessarily, but its commitment is not as strong as the Rehnquist Court's.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Okay, so the main issue we're talking about is, let's presume state sovereignty is on the side of the angels. Who's more on the side of the angels? The Roberts Court or the Rehnquist Court? Well, the difference between the Roberts and Rehnquist Court is this that I see. The professor points out that the preemption cases, namely the cases in which there's a purported conflict between federal and state law. The Roberts Court goes much more towards the federal side, and the Rehnquist Court goes much more towards the local side. Where I see the Roberts Court interested is not in these particular preemption cases as very important. Why? Because a preemption case, once you decide it, it's done. All you decide is whether a piece of legislation supplants a piece